But anyhow, people out there are competing who's going to live in a smaller house. And the whole movement is called the tiny house movement. When you go home, you can search it on the internet. You can look up some YouTube videos. And it's really amazing what people can do within a very, very small space. Like, and these are not just single folks, you know, these are even people with families. Very, very small houses. I just saw a video of a couple in New York who bought an apartment maybe as big as this lounge here. And it's a couple, husband and wife, and they're living there. They have most of the space is taken up by big bed. Yeah, I never understood. I sleep on the floor, by the way, so maybe that's why I can't get it. You don't need a bed, so you have more space. And they have everything there: the kitchen, the shower, living room, all, one wall for each department, and in the middle of it, all is bed. And people put themselves in this frame of mind that tiny is better, more freedom, less financial responsibility, and they're really loving it. And even people who have means to have a larger space will downsize their space and voluntarily live in a smaller space. Anyhow, so that's one thing. The other movement is the minimalistic movement. These are they have quite a bit of overlapping area. They have much in common. Minimalistic movement, these are the people who want to minimalize, want to reduce in all spheres of their physical, material life. They throw phrases like, stuff ties you down. So to have less stuff is to have more freedom. Stuff ties you down. Stuff owns you. So you're thinking you're owning the stuff. Wow, that's a very dramatic ringtone. They give you a heart attack. I used to have an alarm clock, and it sounded more like a nuclear war alarm sound. And I used to wake up with that, and I was thinking, this is terrible. I got to get some birds chirping or something if I want to live. Yeah. I get some loud birds. There's some really annoying birds. So as you're thinking, they say stuff owes you. So you're thinking you owe stuff, but you own stuff, but the stuff ends up owning you. You become slave to this stuff. I mean, you can't move, you can't do things you would want to do because of the stuff. The stuff makes you worry that somebody won't steal it. You have to protect it, maintain it, blah blah blah. And so they're thinking, minimize it. Fewer or lesser, the better. More freedom you have. And then you have downshifters. These are all different movements that are surfacing all over the. Well, I'd say mainly in the United States, but also in Europe and some other places. Spending and consuming less so you can have more time to live. It's a good sentence. Spending and consuming less so you can have more time to live. In other words, they don't think that to earn and to spend and consume is living. They said that's stuff that you sort of have to do. I mean, like, you have a physical body, so you have to provide something for it. You have to shop, groceries, blah blah blah. But in modern times, we sort of expanded that to cover way more than necessary. So you don't have time to live anymore. So people lost this concept of life, of how to live. Do you all remember a few months ago when there was a big outage down here? Mm-hmm. There was half of California without electricity. And I mean, even I myself, who I'm not, I hardly have any possessions. But still, when the electricity was out, I was sort of lost. It's like, okay, so what do I do now? There's no electronic gadget for me to turn on at the moment. And I was looking at all these kids that didn't know what to do with themselves. And then all of a sudden there was a flood of people in the streets. And I thought it was really nice, Like wherever you went, there were people, and even though you didn't have any gadgets, you could be alive. You could communicate. You could do things. I thought it was very interesting. So there you go. So far we have minimalists, we have downshifters, we have tiny home movements, and oh yeah, and they call all this reduction, the stuff reduction program. This one woman called it distilled way of life, and I thought this is just a perfect way to sum it all up. Distilled way of living. Distilled way of living. If you know what the process of distillation does, it removes, I don't know if you're trying to distill alcohol from something, you remove everything which isn't alcohol, So what you're left with some kind of essence, that which you really want. So distilled way of life, you just turn up the heat and you ditch everything that's really not life, All the artificiality start ditching little by little. And living in like the people of the tiny house movement, when they force themselves to live in a tiny space, and because they force themselves to live in a tiny space, they're forced to think, what do I really need? And then they find, themselves going through the list of things they have, and then at the end they realize they can live with a whole lot of things they otherwise thought couldn't live without, and experiencing great sense of freedom. So they conclude that therefore less is more. So one more thing they're finding is that when you have greater expectations lesser the experience of the thing. And lesser the expectation, greater the experience of the thing. So if you're expecting a whole lot, even you're expecting a whole lot from this drum, then when you get it, even though it may perform up to your expectation, your experience of it is only so much good. But if you're expecting nothing from it, or very little, then even if objectively speaking the drum is less than the drum of the other person, the first person, your experience of it will be greater. So it's just a mental thing. You just psych yourself up. You build up all these expectations, and then you have to work so hard to have all this great, immense stuff that you become a slave to. And therefore, more is less and less is more. So, and I know from traveling to the third world countries, people of the third world countries, they objectively have way less than, for example, Americans, average Americans. And yet they're objectively much more happier people. Even though sometimes they might be invalids, like I made so many trips to India. And you'll find people, not too often, but often enough, people who are disfigured, physically disfigured. And yet they're very happy people. Why? Because they don't have huge expectations. They have small expectations, but they have great spiritual expectations. Because how is it possible to live a life without great expectations? Because if you don't have great expectations, you're sort of missing out on life. Your own very value within your own very eyes is reduced. And you feel miserable. So if you're not going, if having great material expectations is a formula for trouble, hardship, then what other field do you have left to have great expectations in? It's the spiritual field. So in the spiritual field you can freely have huge expectations. Expect a lot. Without having any bad side effects. So I thought this was a great lesson. And all this, reduction movement, it goes really well with spiritual life, because spiritual life is different. Spiritual development and spiritual pleasure is different from the development and pleasure from that's found on the mental and physical plane. So in order to free up the time so that you can develop yourself spiritually, you reduce your mental and your physical needs. So, tiny house movement, thumbs up, reductionists and so on. But really cool stuff. You folks should totally look it up when you get home, if you still have internet connection. I mean, internet too. I remember when internet didn't exist. Even when cell phones were introduced. Some of the kids who grew up with cell phones, they don't even have a concept of a wired phone. The phone with a cord. I remember when phones had those things that you had to turn dials.
Yeah.
My God, a friend of mine worked at the reception at a hotel. So he'd be connecting calls, people call from a room, and then he would have to dial the number, It'd take forever to dial a number. But no one thought it was a difficulty, And then, someone introduces a new product, it's a speed dial. You just press 1, 2, or 3 buttons, and it'll dial 28 numbers for you. And then all of a sudden, the turn dial phone becomes
Awesome.
Becomes a pain-producing, pain-issuing sucker.